Hey everybody, good to see you back. So today we are doing our reading from Exodus. Now, as a reminder, the questions, discussions for this devotion, along with the reference for the scripture, is down in the comment section. So, encouragement to talk about those questions after the devotion at home, and hit pause and take a break to read our scripture for today. It is Exodus chapter 19, verses 2 to 8. All right, so now that you've had a chance to read it, let's dive in. So this is basically the part of the Exodus, the Israelites leaving Egypt, where God has brought them to Mount Sinai. He's brought them up out of Egypt, and now God is making a covenant with them. And it's important to understand that God makes covenants with his people. And there are two different types of covenants that God makes. One of them is one-sided, where God is doing all the actions. The second kind of covenant is a two-sided covenant, where God promises something and then has expectations of the people in return. So what we have in Exodus 19 is an example of a two-sided covenant. Now we have an example of the one-sided covenant. One of those examples would be the covenant he makes with Abraham back in Genesis 17. God makes the promise that Abraham's descendants will be a mighty nation and the whole world will be blessed through his offspring, aka Jesus. Now, in this covenant, this two-sided covenant, God says that he reminds the Israelites he's brought them up out of Egypt, and he calls it on eagle's wings, and then he says in verse 5, now if you obey me fully and keep my commandments, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possessions. And although the whole earth is mine, and then verse 6, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So I'm going to be playing off this idea of the two covenants because they're really, really important. And I'm going to be referencing 1 Peter quite a bit because there's a lot of parallels there, believe it or not. So first off, this idea of a one-sided covenant. How wonderful is it that we have a God who is the one who does all the acting, all the promises, all of the work for us. He called Abraham out of obscurity. And, the Bible doesn't say that Abraham was a particularly righteous or believing, God-fearing person before God entered the picture. And that's really significant in this idea of being called God's treasured possessions. Because we don't start out good and then God says, ooh, that one looks nice, I'll take that one. No, we, like Abraham, start off in sin and obscurity and not knowing who this God is. And just like Abraham, God calls us and picks us to be one of his treasured possessions. God makes us promises of being called his child when we're baptized, and that flows blessings upon blessings. So a lot of parallels can be drawn between us and Abraham this one-sided promise that God gives. This idea of being called a treasured possession. Now that fits in with what we read from 1 Peter chapter 2. Now there's a verse in there about how we are God's holy nation, a chosen people, a royal priesthood. And when Peter's writing these words, he's writing them not only to Jews, but also to Gentiles. Now, Gentiles were basically everyone who's non-Jewish, so me, all right, and anybody else who's watching this who is not of Jewish descent. So that is who Peter is talking to, and he calls all of them, Jew and Gentile, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a chosen people, okay, a treasured possession is what that amounts to, being God's treasured possessions. And that reference in 1 Peter chapter 2 is really the great summary of the Christian identity, and then also what Christian life looks like, what the response to that Christian faith is. So that is what us as Gentiles get. We get to be called God's treasured possessions, just like Jews do. And consequently, that is because of, I think, in part because of this two-sided covenant that we're reading about in Exodus chapter 19. So again, remembering that God has chosen these Israelites, the descendants of Abraham, out of obscurity. He could have left them in Egypt, but God knew the promises that he had made to Abraham to bring the people to the promised land, to make them a holy nation. And interestingly enough, when we read the Old Testament, it talks about God bringing them up out of Egypt. It is not like I brought you out and wasn't this nice. It was more of I took you by the hand and dragged you out. Okay, that's the way the original text reads. So you already get the Israelites having this attitude, right? We're going to call it an attitude towards God and listening. And so God makes this promise that these people will be his treasured possessions if they obey. Now, this is the part where we get into this two-sided covenant, right? God has given a promise, a blessing, and these are his expectations. Now, going back into 1 Peter, this is actually 1 Peter chapter 3. And in this, Peter talks about this reality that our actions have consequences, right? God gave us the commandments for a reason. They are good. They keep us from sinning. Sin has consequences. And so this is what God tries to avoid with us. He doesn't want us to sin. He doesn't want us to have consequences, but the consequences are a natural repercussion of the sinning. And so this is where this two-sided covenant that God makes with the Israelites means a lot for us as Gentiles. So God says that he will have the Israelites be his treasured possessions. And I believe that the same logic exists here as it does for the Garden of Eden. God knew from all eternity that as soon as he made Adam and Eve, that sin would enter the world and his son would have to die. This is not like the plan went awry, quick, we need something to fix it. No, God is outside of time. So he sees the whole lay of the land. He knew that in creating Adam and Eve, that would mean that Jesus would have to die. He knew it. Okay, this is not a plan B sort of a thing. And I believe that he makes this promise to the Israelites, this two-sided covenant, with the same thing in mind. He knew the Israelites couldn't keep it. And so when he makes this covenant, he does it with the understanding to know that, guess what? The promise would be broken. And now God finds a new treasured possession, a new people, which is the church. It's you and me. It's anyone who believes in Jesus. So it is not just contained to the Jewish heritage anymore, partly because the Jews rejected Jesus. They rejected this promise. They disobeyed all the way back from to Exodus. And this is also the wonderful thing about God making the one-sided covenant, because he made another one-sided covenant with us when Jesus died on the cross and rose again. He said, anyone who believes will be saved. And that was it. And now we get to live as God's treasured possessions, the same way that God loved and delivered the Israelites then. He loves and he delivers us now in this life, and then into the life to come, which is heaven. So there you go. All right, we will start off tomorrow with Psalm 100. Bye.